You should be ready whenever you are.
Okay, are we ready to go, Hannah?
Yes, we are.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to the UDS 4.0 Digital Voice Workshop. My name is Sarah Biber, and I am the Executive Director at NACC, and we are thrilled to be teaming up with the CTF Technology Workgroup to host this training workshop today, which will be focused on digital voice data collection. The goal of this workshop is to provide guidance on the consent process, recording, procedures, and data storage for digital voice data. You're going to have the opportunity also to hear from some really exceptional leaders in the digital voice field who will present their research findings, emphasizing the scientific importance and potential of digital voice data. So really looking forward to hearing from everyone today. Next slide, please. So I want to just kick off, start us off by mentioning that NACC is really excited about digital data and is committed to collaborating with the ADRCs to advance digital data collection. There are, next slide, there are critical challenges that urgently need to be addressed in the field right now. Next slide. And, you know, to effectively tackle these challenges, we know that researchers need to be able to access increasing amounts of multimodal data that are high quality, harmonized, and integrated to advance the field. So we think that there's a huge opportunity, next slide please, to leverage digital tools to advance ADRD discovery and translation and to make this research more inclusive. Next slide. As part of NACC's data platform modernization, expansion, we're working to pilot pipelines for digital data collection, integration, and sharing. Next slide. We also recently updated our IRB to enable NACC to collect, store, and share this type of data more broadly in the future. Next slide. And as you know, ADRD does enter its digital age, you know, it is a bit like the Wild West out there. So digital data collection, as you all know, covers a lot of concepts. It's very heterogeneous. Many are collecting this data, but there are few, if any, standards out there. So next slide. We recently launched and revamped CTF Technology Workgroup, which is who we worked with to put on this workshop today. That will be focused on developing digital data collection standards and identifying the most impactful digital data modalities for the ADRC program moving forward. And so this group is teaming up, next slide please, to develop guidelines for digital voice recordings of the neuropsychological exam. So that's kind of like where we started as low-hanging fruit, and you'll be hearing a lot about that today. And then NACC will start collecting, integrating, and sharing this data as part of UDS 4.0. So you're going to hear a lot more about the value of this type of digital voice data today. Before I pass off to our next speaker, I did want to briefly mention that NACC is engaged in piloting additional data pipelines in collaboration with ADRCs. Next slide. So we have a pilot right now in collaboration with BU and Emory that's focused on collecting 2 UDS and non-UDS tests via the Linus platform. Next slide. We also, as many of you know, recently launched a digital pilot program in collaboration with Gage Ventures this past year. 2 slides ahead, please. And we will be announcing the teams that were selected for funding for this next week. So we're really excited to make that announcement. And lastly, in the future, we plan to host community challenges focused on digital data, including, we hope, digital voice data, working in collaboration with ADRCs and Sage Bionetworks. So if you're excited about digital data as well, which I presume you are if you're at this workshop today, you know, and you are interested in collaborating with NACC on any of these types of initiatives, I encourage you to reach out. And with that, I want to pass off to our next speaker. You can go to the next slide. One more. Okay, so I'll pass off to Rhoda. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And I'm just going to sort of tee up what I hope will be an interesting panel for the rest of the session. I just wanted to sort of remind people that, you know, this concept of actually studying digital voice within the realm of neurodegenerative disorders. Voice itself, that's been going on for a really long time, right? We study dysarthria. We know about, aphasia. I come from the Boston VA, where the Aphasia Research Center really sort of led the way, where we were really interested in speech and language. Of course, there's all the speech and language pathologists who can tell you about the importance of studying changes in speech and language capabilities. So I wanted to always make sure that we understand that when we move into the digital era, we're not doing digital for digital's sake. We're actually doing digital because it's going to enhance the kind of science that we've been trying to do. And in this case, digital voice is no different. As we all know, speaking is a very complex cognitive undertaking. And so embedded as we speak are lots and lots of rich information about our cognitive capabilities. And it's not limited to our cognition. It also, through the tone, and through even some of the word choices, et cetera, you can also pick up, for instance, mental health related, neuropsychiatric kinds of symptoms. So I think it's really important to think about in this, focus on digital voice. It really is helping us move forward something that we've already been studying. Now we're able to do it much more effectively, just like we're now able to look at in vivo biomarkers, right? Either through imaging or blood. Now we're able to look at cognitive and other related behavioral symptoms at much greater granularity than we have before. So I wanted to sort of anchor that. And then just remind us, the concept of digital voice is relatively new. And it's certainly with the advent of all the digital recorders that are out there. For me, it was triggered when Siri was first emerged on the iPhone, that I became really aware that this is actually a tool in which we can do that. And so we have a very brief history, actually, in which digital voice is now a tool for us to use more going forward. But it is in the context that studying voice itself is something that's actually more old science than new science. So with that, I'm going to pass it on. And our first speaker, who I'm very excited actually to have him present to you, is Brad Dickerson. So Brad, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you're going to help make the case for why this is all so exciting.
Thanks so much, Rhoda, and thanks to the group for the invitation.
Brad, we lost audio from you.
Nope.
Anyone else hear Brad?
Nope. Can't. Sorry, Brad. We can't
hear him. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just trying to get that audio to get ready to share. Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what's in a voice? In some cases, the earliest indicator of a neurodegenerative disease. Many of you may be familiar with Linda Ronstadt and her long, productive singing career. And the first symptom of what was eventually diagnosed as progressive supranuclear palsy in her was the loss of her ability to sing, unfortunately for the world. We have a local patient who's been public with his experience of apraxia of speech, and just retired as the voice of the Bruins. He'd been calling games for a couple of decades and has given us permission to go back to the public record of recordings to try to see if we can identify when his apraxia of speech first began developing. In general, as Rhoda was alluding to, digital voice analytics can be a biomarker of clinical syndromes or etiologic diagnoses, or just simply of abnormalities of motor speech, which I think is probably one of the most obvious abnormalities that you can pick up on, and that clinicians, I too spent time at the Boston JPVA Aphasia Research Center back in training, and learned a lot about how clinicians rate aphasia and apraxia of speech and other disorders of speech and language, almost always qualitatively and using ordinal scales from the diagnostic aphasia exam, for example. And then we can look at cognitive functions through the lens of speech and language, specific syndromes that affect language, of course, but also amnestic syndromes, dysexecutive. I'll talk about a finding we recently published on posterior cortical atrophy, and then thought disorders that include psychosis that are really interestingly captured sometimes in the preclinical or prodromal phase. And then affective functions, as Rhoda was alluding to, mental health related, either primary psychiatric disorders. A lot of work is going on in the technological realm at McLean and other locations in looking at these speech and language biomarkers of diagnosis or response to therapy in people with primary psychiatric disorders. But I think we have great potential to look at these in patients with neurodegenerative diseases as well. So we've been recording digital audio going back to 2008. With digital audio recorders that we would then upload to, and video recorders that we would upload to local shared file areas. But then since 2018 in secure online platforms and phones, we always consent participants for recording and sharing of digital audio and explain to them that we'll de-identify it, of course, as best as possible from any spoken PHI or PII, recognizing, as we'll hear from Cody later, that there's a lot of identifying information in the voice itself, and increasingly have moved from local storage to secure online storage space with cloud-based backups, recognizing some of the need for confidentiality there. But for those of you who have not experienced what it sounds like to listen to a person with apraxia of speech, with or without mixed dysarthria, I thought I would play one of the recordings from an early presentation of one of our patients with this condition who gave permission for full sharing of the video, and her family did too. And we followed her for years and learned that she had an autopsy diagnosis of a 4-repeat tau disorder, the progressive supranuclear palsy pathology, but not presenting with any motor features other than her apraxia of speech.
Waiting my garden yesterday. Was waiting my garden.
Waiting? Can you write it down for me?
Weeding her
yes,
garden.
Oh,
yes.
weeding your garden. I'm sorry.
Allergic AC.
You're brave keeping a garden when
Yes,
you have
yes,
allergies
yeah.
like that. Wow, it's amazing.
So the
AC makes me congested.
can you say the full word for AC?
Air condition.
Okay,
Air condition.
good.
Ing.
Lovely woman, and really a very vociferous research participant who always came in with a positive attitude. So we used to, as I said, rate these features by trained clinician raters, which goes a long way, just like we do with scales like the CDR, but increasingly we recognize the value of quantifying the slowing of articulation rate or speech rate or other aspects of people's speech when they have disorders like this. And so one of our postdocs, speech language pathologist who was getting her PhD, showed that, as you would predict, non-fluent primary progressive aphasia patients have slowed articulation rate when quantified compared to patients with other forms of primary progressive aphasia. And it turns out that when you compare the fluency rating that is rated by a trained clinician in green to the speech rate and articulation rate that are quantified, that the quantification does better than the clinician ordinal rating scales in differentiating patients with non-fluent PPA from patients with logopenic PPA, which it can be sometimes a difficult differentiation to make. And Frank Gunther at Boston University is a wonderful collaborator who has a theoretical model of the parts of the cortex that are critical for motor speech, and that's depicted in the schematic at the top of the page here. So these are supplementary motor and premotor cortical areas that are important for the motor control of speech. And so we did an analysis of a mixed group of PPA patients with all three subtypes, asking the question, where does cortical atrophy correlate best with slowed articulation rate? And it turned out that across the entire cortex, it's simply those specific areas that Dr. Gunther hypothesized where atrophy is correlated with slowed articulation rate. Of course, we know that atrophy in other areas are correlated with other aspects of language disorders, but this is really the basis for apraxia of speech. And what's so interesting, I think, is that the Mayo Clinic group that's really pioneered our understanding of apraxia of speech has shown, and we've found this useful ourselves, that if you get FDG PET scans on individual patients with apraxia of speech, many of them have hypometabolism that's located as predicted based on the brain systems subserving the motor control of speech. So you can see supplementary motor and dorsal premotor involvement in this individual patient with apraxia of speech. And we think of that as a diagnostic biomarker that's congruent with the science as we understand it in terms of the circuits of the brain that control these functions, and also confirmation of the degeneration that we would expect if the person's apraxia of speech is likely due to a form of frontotemporal lobar degeneration or related disease. So we did some work also trying to differentiate the motor speech disorders in ALS from ataxic dysarthria due to progressive ataxia, Parkinson's disease, non-fluent progressive aphasia, in a large sample of people that we had these recordings on. And these characteristics are distinctive, and you can see example descriptions of articulatory patterns that are taught to speech-language pathology trainees as helping them differentiate the likely disease that's associated with these patterns of dysarthria or apraxia of speech. But you can quantify acoustic features from motor speech, from speech recordings that relate to coordination, consistency, precision, speed, and rate, and other metrics that are illustrated through the schematic here. And you can see that as illustrated by the more rightward bars showing a greater abnormality compared to controls, and these little colored bars on the left kind of giving you a sense of the patterns, that across these 4 different phenotypes, there are specifically distinct patterns of acoustic abnormalities in the features of short speech samples that differentiate each of these from the others. So moving now from motor speech, which I think is a very obvious application, to language, Negin Rezai in our group has led a lot of work that has been very interesting in going back to these old recordings and finding new findings from them. And this was one of the first papers where she identified a syntax lexicon trade-off in language in patients with primary progressive aphasia. As you all know, probably word frequency is a widely used measure in studies of linguistics, but the frequency of syntactic structures in sentences has not been previously measured. So working with an expert in syntax at MIT, Ted Gibson, we developed a novel metric of syntactic complexity and examined both the word and syntactic frequencies in patients with PPA. And as you would expect, the logopenic and semantic PPA patients use higher frequency words. They use more common words. They don't use the specific nouns and verbs that are typically expected. Whereas non-fluent agrammatic PPA patients use higher frequency syntax. They use simpler structures, more canonical subject-verb structures, as has been predicted from previous work. But the interesting thing was that the non-fluent agrammatic PPA patients actually used lower frequency words. They have lower frequency lexical retrieval, possibly as a way to convey meaning efficiently despite the simplification of their sentence structures. So that was a novel finding. And also in the entire group, when people use lower frequency words, they use higher frequency syntactic structures and vice versa. So there's a trade-off between the complexity of syntax and the complexity of word retrieval. And this is also actually present in the utterances of healthy speakers, suggesting that whenever a healthy person speaks, when they use less common words that are more specific, they tend to use simpler sentence structures. So maybe a fundamental property of language. Recently, we just got this paper accepted to Brain that used artificial intelligence that was unsupervised to try to classify PPA into its subtypes. So there's a lot of debate for those who focus on this about whether primary progressive aphasia is best subdivided into the 3 canonical variants that Marilu Gorno-Tempini and the consensus group formalized in 2011, or whether there may be better ways to classify it. So we harness the capabilities of AI and natural language processing to perform completely unsupervised classification of concise connected speech samples of picture description from PPA patients. And the unsupervised model discerned 3 distinct clusters with 88.5% agreement with independent clinical diagnoses. And we looked at the patterns of cortical atrophy in the 3 data-driven clusters, which corresponded very well to the clinical diagnostic atrophy patterns that you typically expect, with the leftmost cluster being mostly formed of the semantic variant patients, the middle cluster mostly logopenics, and the rightmost cluster mostly non-fluent. So this is simply asking the system to put people together if their speech and language is more similar to each other, and distinguish them if they're less similar to each other. So we also then use natural language processing to try to open the black box and figure out what the linguistic features are that best associate these variants from each other. And 17 features emerged, many of which were features that have been known to be distinguishing. And a classifier using these features obtained very high accuracy in predicting the subtypes versus healthy controls and versus each other. But one of the important discoveries was that if you categorize verbs into low versus high frequency verbs, then you can identify a novel feature that is that distinguishes, as I was alluding to before, the non-fluent patients from the logopenic patients in particular, with the non-fluent patients using even lower frequency verbs than controls, and the logopenic patients tending to use abnormally high frequency verbs, not just nouns, as had been discussed before. And so you can see that these are differentiation along those lines. So then we turn to PCA. You might think of posterior cortical atrophy as being a clinical syndrome that is not particularly relevant when it comes to digital voice. But it turns out that if you compare language samples of PCA patients with controls when they're describing a picture versus when they're talking about what they did for their occupation, that's just from memory, the patients with PCA showed significant language deficits in the visually dependent task, characterized by higher word frequency, prolonged utterance latency, it took them longer to say the words, and fewer spatial relational words. But they didn't show any of these features in the visually independent task, talking about their occupation, which was indistinguishable from control. So they really struggled with certain visual elements, and this was highly predictive of their diagnosis. And you can see this depicted here with the darker the black or gray, the more frequently these elements are mentioned by controls, whereas in PCA, they don't talk about the kite or the girl running with the kite or a number of the most salient visual features as frequently as a control person does. So even when a person's problem is not primarily language, language can reflect what's going on with them. I'll just skip over this briefly for the interest of time, but we've looked across English and Persian and found that there are similar problems with language informativeness, and this is now archived if you want to look it up. We've developed the Language Informativeness Index that basically helps us understand how informative the words are that people are saying when they describe a picture, and showing that the loss of informativeness declines similarly across both English and Persian speakers, with Negin Rezai being a Persian immigrant, an Iranian immigrant, so she's got a lot of interest in this. And interestingly, English has a set of particularly high frequency verbs that are not reflected in Persian. And so there's been a traditional distinction saying that if you have frontal damage, you probably have problems with noun usage, where if you have temporal parietal damage to the language circuitry, you're more likely to have problems with noun usage. But why is it that AD patients who typically have more prominent posterior cortical degeneration have reduced usage of both nouns and verbs? It turns out it's probably a reflection of the fact that most of these studies have been done in the English language. And so when you look at Persian, you don't see those features. And regression models that treated noun and verb frequencies as separate predictors did not outperform models that simply considered overall word frequency alone in classifying AD versus control. So some language abnormalities are reflective of not just the disease, but the language that the person is speaking. So we're hoping to be able to use some of these types of measurements to begin to determine whether people receiving lecanemab therapy are starting to have a slowing of cognitive decline. And you can see superimposed on the clinical trial data from lecanemab, we're doing monthly assessments with short 20-minute remote cognitive assessments with speech and language analyses, trying to get a run-in phase prior to the time they start getting their treatment, with the hope that we'll be able to see a flattening of that curve in these studies of individual patients receiving disease-modifying therapy. We'll keep you posted on that. And we started a collaboration funded by a pilot study from the Mass AITC with Sond, a company that has a great mental fitness app that's been validated on the iPhone against standard measures of depression and anxiety, and started applying it to cognitive function with more than 50 patients from our clinic enrolled, and weekly assessments that have led to more than 2,500 voice samples, looking at both language and speech biomarkers. You can see the array of patient diagnoses, really looking a lot at feasibility here. And the first thing we've shown is that language informative index is useful for screening for cognitive impairment, with more than 95% of the patients showing lower than minus 1.5 standard deviation performance compared to controls. So this short assessment might be useful for identifying abnormality. And then we're hoping that the profiles of the specific test performance will help measure this cognitive profiles and syndromes. So I just want to close by mentioning our experience so far with digital voice in the LEADS study, the longitudinal early onset AD study, which we've been doing since 2018. We said to all the site PIs, we want to just record the verbal assessments in the NACC UDS 3.0 and AVLT. And they said, sure, let's try it. What do you think's involved? And 14 of the 18 sites are ADRCs. And so we trained the coordinators on procedures like you'll see in a moment, and recorded these stories. And essentially no additional time is added to participant visits. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes of additional time for the coordinator to manage the files and do the cleaning and uploading and so forth. And we've consented for full sharing of the digital audio, with almost everyone agreeing. The files are stripped of recognizable PHI, PII, stored locally and shared with Indiana University. There's been one publication already, and we're working on other analyses. So we really feel like these 14 sites have been very pleased with how straightforward it's been to do the recording of the verbal assessments that we've done so far. And we hope that the experience of LEADS will reinforce the efforts that everyone here is trying to pursue to help us develop these incredibly rich data sets that will lend itself to increasingly sophisticated analyses for the decades to come as technology advances, and make the cognitive data that's collected even richer in conjunction with the variety of additional data that's available through NACC UDS. So I'd like to thank my team for all the work they've done to help make this possible. And in the minute or two we have left, if anyone has questions, happy to try to field those. Thank you very much.
I don't see any open questions in the Q&A box, but if anyone wants to raise their hand, we could take one that way too.
I think of it as the gift that keeps on giving. And I think we'll hear from some of our other speakers that these digital voice data are in many ways very analogous to blood biomarkers that we all never envisioned being able to do what they're doing these days. And some of the richness that's in imaging data that we just did not even conceptualize back when we first started drawing our ROIs around different brain structures to get their volumes. And so I think that, you know, all of these different modalities of data, when collected in their raw form and ideally shared with investigators with a lot of creative and sophisticated ideas, you know, can have new information pulled out of them that in some cases we never even thought might be present. So I think it's super exciting. And of course, DNA is probably the preeminent example of that type of a sample.
All right, if there's no questions, thank you so much, Brad, for giving that wonderful talk. I think we'll move on to the consent and IRB section presented by Sudeshna Das.
Yeah, I just want to point out there was one question.
Oh, there is. Okay, thank you. I'll read that out. This is from Thomas Kellogg asking, have any other languages been examined other than English and Farsi?
Well, yeah, a lot of people are looking at Spanish, of course, and there's a couple of great groups looking at French and German. So a lot of our European colleagues have been doing this. There haven't been as many cross-linguistic studies that have tried to look for common versus distinctive features as I think we're going to be seeing. But there are a number of groups in the US that are affiliated with ADRCs that are accessing internationally shared multi-language data, including various dialects of Chinese and Korean, to look for the common and distinctive features across languages. So I think we're about to see a lot of publications on these topics, because I think the data sets are available and are being cleaned and analyzed. And so I think it'll start to come out very soon. But we haven't looked at others ourselves, but there are a wonderful array of groups around the country and around the world that are doing these kind of comparative linguistic analyses. And I think it's super exciting to think about what we're going to learn from those.
It looks like we actually have a couple other questions before we jump into the next section. So I'll let Jet go ahead and speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this amazing presentation. Very insightful. I was wondering, because some of the work that you presented was on picture description and really on tasks that are aimed at collecting connected speech with very little interaction from the interviewer. So you have a very pure sample of the participants. And other work that you talked about was about recording the whole session of neuropsychological tests with a participant, where there is a lot of interaction with the interviewer. So I was wondering, how do you go about in those samples where there's a lot of interaction with the interviewer, about diarizing, about separating the voice from the participants with that from the interviewer, so you can analyze it for both acoustic and lexical features?
Thanks, Jed. Yeah, you've done a lot of great work on this topic yourself, so I'm glad you're here. I think we'll hear from Cody in more depth about this, but as you know better than many of us, there are emerging automated technologies to try to diarize or distinguish one speaker from another with relatively little training on each speaker's labeled voice. And so I think it's not going to be too long before this is practically plug and play to clean the files, so that you've got, one file that's specific to one person and one file that's specific to another person, if that's what you want to do. Obviously, I think many of us are interested, yourself included, in what actually happens during a true dialogue. And in that case, we want to label people, but not necessarily separate the files from each other. So I think there's a lot to be said for pressing record and letting it go, with the idea that in leads, we've actually specifically instructed people to start it when the test starts and stop it when the test stops, so that we can try to minimize the need for cleaning and make it more efficient for people to analyze the test that they want to analyze. But I think that, increasingly, we're not trying to do that, so that we have the best opportunity to capture unstructured interactions in between structured tests. And I think there's so much information there, as you've been working on, that, we should be doing more of that. And we've started doing that in structured clinical interviews and in responses between patient and caregiver when they're having diagnosis disclosed to themselves. So I think there's going to be a huge amount of interesting work that emerges on this, and that increasingly we'll be able to analyze in a more automated way, obviously with appropriate cleaning by trained individuals as necessary.
Thank you. I love how you highlight the benefits of both formats, and I couldn't agree with your answer more. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we have one more question in the chat. This is from Ronald Hawley asking, what is the process for scrubbing an audio file to remove PHI, and who is handling that task?
That is the topic we're about to get into. So hang on and you'll hear a lot about that. Thank you for the perfect segue.
Yes, thank you. And then I'll hand off to Sadeshna. Thanks, Brad.
Right. Okay, so we heard from Brad and Rhoda how exciting digital voice can be, and the the promise of using digital voice for diagnostics and prognostics, hopefully at some point. So when we want to roll out digital voice as part of UDS 4 to the ADRCs, one of the first things that we want to think about is the consent process and the IRB protocol for that. So first I'll talk about informed consent, and when you want to write the consent form, you want to clearly explain the reason for the audio recording and how it will be used, and then describe how the recordings will be kept confidential and all the measures that are put in place to protect the participants' privacy. So this is and like any other data that we collect from the UDS participants, and you want to maintain confidentiality and privacy with the same standards of good clinical practice. Data sharing, so the informed consent must specify who will have access to the recordings and who will the data be shared with. And finally end with like explain any potential benefits and risks associated with the recording. So I'll give you an example from the lead study that Brad mentioned in his talk, and here they take like recordings of like structured neuropsych tests where they collect only the responses of these neuropsych tests. So in this in the consent, this is an excerpt from the consent form where they specify that we will be recording any responses to some of the memory and language tests, and they explain why they are using this and the benefit, and they said that these would be allow researchers to analyze the responses in order to answer important questions about the behavioral markers of speech, language, and cognition. And as the research progresses, you might not want to box yourself in and insert a phrase like such as, so that you just put examples, and this enables you to like include this same samples for further analysis. So I'll go back to the point that both Rhoda and Brad mentioned, which is like we want to collect this data, and Rhoda gives the example of blood, and it will be years before, years or months, who knows, before we can actually make use of it, but we'd like to start collecting the data as soon as possible, because the earlier you start, the more data you'll have. So when you're explaining that in the consent process, you want to be a little general with giving examples rather than box yourself into a particular purpose, right? And then you the consent also has lines on how the recordings will be maintained on secure servers, and access is only to those with training and permission from the study team. Only those researchers have access, right? Here's another example from the iConnect study led by Dr. Hiroko Daj. And the iConnect study is based on the hypothesis that social isolation is a risk factor for dementia. And in the study, they use video chats to see if that intervention has any association with cognition of the study participants. So in their informed consent, this is an extract from the iConnect study's informed consent form. They say that, again, they explain what is being done. So all video chats will be video and audio recorded. Part of the testing calls will also be audio recorded. The phone calls will be also audio recorded. And then the purpose, they explain in a very general terms, saying that these recordings will be used for educational materials as well as research analysis, right? So you can keep it pretty general. And then, of course, they have, terms about the privacy, will protect your privacy when sharing these audio recordings. And they say who they'll share it with, approved researchers, and then make sure that, that the audio recording doesn't contain any information within the recordings, like name, telephone, or other information. And also you want to keep it separate from the other identifying parts so that the audio file isn't like directly linked with other identifying information. And then they mention the risk, like because everyone's voice is unique, it might be possible that someone listening to the recording could identify you just from the sound or the pattern of your voice, right? And another thing to think about in the consent form is an additional consent, and this is required if in the state of Massachusetts, for example, if the audio recording is not an essential part of the study. So in UDS 4, when audio recording is optional, the states that require it, you would need an additional consent form where you ask the participant, do you give us permission to audio record your responses to some of the memory and language tests? And then you need the participant to check off explicitly on this additional consent form, as opposed to the lead study where the audio recording is an integral part of the study and it doesn't require this additional consent form. So moving on to the IRB study protocol, again, for the objective, clearly state the purpose of the study and the role of the audio recordings in achieving these study objectives, and provide some details of the recording procedure, specify what will be recorded. Is it free text conversations like the iConnect study, or in UDS, just like leads, we are envisioning taking recordings of the neuropsych battery, and then you can detail the types of equipment that will be used for recording, and also the setting, whether it's office or virtual or like phone visits. You obviously have to describe how you'll store the data and where you'll store it, and all measures in place to protect participant confidentiality, just like with any other data type that you would do for good clinical practice. And finally, you want to specify who will have access to the recordings and who will the data be shared with. Again, I'm just going to present like the excerpts from the lead study and the iConnect study. So you have specific examples of like what needs to be written. And these excerpts that we're collecting from these two studies, as well as like the Framingham study, which led by Rhoda, has been collecting digital voice for a while. And I think Adney is also starting. So all of these, the examples and excerpts from these different studies will be available to the ADRC community so that you can learn from those and adapt them for your specific center. So here in the leads study, in the audio recording, here they write that a recording device such as the Olympus so-and-so digital voice recorder or a similar digital recording device will be used, right? So this such as clause allows you to replace it with another recording device without having to go back and amend your protocol for the study. So we really recommend keeping things a little flexible. And then in terms of the storage, you want to mention that these will be, for the lead study, it was securely transmitted and stored in like common databases, NACC for the ADRCs. And the audio recorded during the administration will be cleaned of any protected health information. Any PHI will be scrubbed from the recording before it is uploaded to this common server. And this is the protocol excerpt from the iConnect study that Hiroko Dodge is leading. And here, again, it explains what is being done, which is it's explaining a little bit about the video chat system, and that it's a secure, scalable, and cost-effective video chat platform for conducting in-home telehealth with geriatric populations. And then it enables researcher, clinicians, and older adults easy access to a private meeting space for a chat at the touch of a button. So it's like geared, this chat platform is geared for like older adults and to keep it secure and scalable. And it you also highlight here, or they highlighted that the platform facilitates joining these services by automatically entering required join commands for the subject with just one click. You can, the UI has two quick options, join and restart. So you explain about the platform and the what you're going to do in that study, and then also describe that all the recordings will be kept in HIPAA compliant institution supported cloud sources. Again, not mentioning specifics, so that when the institution transitions from one to the other, you don't need to go back and amend your protocol. So that's all I have, but I'd like to end with some helpful suggestions. So one that I have mentioned while I was giving the examples for the LEAD study and the iConnect study, keep the purpose and the details of the study procedures general and non-specific, and this avoids boxing yourself in the future. So use examples with like such as opposed to like blanket statements. And then the other thing I want to mention, that this privacy and security of the data should be protected in the same manner as you would any other data type, such as imaging or genotyping, and adhering to good clinical practices. Voice, yes, can be recognized, like there is, personally identifiable information in the voice recording, but genotype is the ultimate, nature given 3 billion base pairs identifier. So you would think about privacy and security the same way you do with any other data, right? So you'd locally store it in a HIPAA compliant storage solution provided by your institution, and limit the access for the local study, local storage to only IRB approved study staff. And mention that it'll be transmitted securely to NACC, which has the NIH certificate of confidentiality, and NACC from UW has the UW's IRB regulates and makes sure that NACC is able to keep the data safe and secure. And just to keep in mind that this data won't be widely shared by NACC with other researchers until we're like 100% confident that the data has been adequately de-identified. So we envision that the data collection will start sooner, and we can work through these processes and start collecting the data before we start distributing it. And even when NACC starts distributing it, it'll be done with the same process that they use for other kinds of data, which means that they only share it with identified researchers, not some robots. You have to specify that you're a bona fide researcher, and then you sign with a data use agreement about what you can or cannot do with the data. So again, there are lots of guardrails already in place, and this data will be shared with the same strict privacy and confidentiality as any other kind of data. So with that, I'd like to stop and get any questions.
I can kick things off with a question that's in the chat. Following up on the question submitted previously, what is the process for scrubbing an audio file to remove PHI, and who's handling that task?
That's a great question, and that's the next speaker, Cody, is going to address exactly that.
We have another question also. This one is from Ronald Hawley asking, the Olympus recorder mentioned is not encrypted, which poses a significant risk should it be lost or misplaced if it contains PHI. Is there a concern with the UDS V4 that only the more expensive encrypted recorders should be used?
I can't speak to that. I think that will be up to the ADRC and their local institution. And, so for example, if we want to use the iPad or some other simpler device to do it, we always make sure that these are locked and in cabinets and in in a building with like triple security in place, like building access, then room access and file cabinet access. So so we would do that, but other ADRCs might have a different protocol and a way of doing it. And so I'd say like it really depends on the individual ADRC.
I can say that, you know, our protocol is that once the file, like immediately after the visit, the file is uploaded to the servers that are secure and deleted from the recorder. The recorder never leaves the building to begin with, but we have a recorder at each site where we do the recordings, and they don't leave the building. Nobody carries them anywhere. So, you know, I don't know if this is best practices, but I think that the recordings don't live on the recorder. They're just captured by the recorder and then they're taken off the recorder.
Yeah, I would say then if you're capturing it from smartphones, then you have a way of encrypting it, right, in real time in order to do that. So there will be, and I think Jeff is going to actually speak to sort of the fact that there's probably not a one size fits all, as I think Sudeshna was kind of alluding to when we're doing this. So, you know, what we're trying to do is at least give you a range of the ways in which to do this. And I think each way you choose to capture digital voice will have its own sort of circumstances, I think, with respect to thinking about privacy and security.
Okay, I don't think we have any additional questions in the chat.
Yeah. So maybe we'll move on to the next one then, Brittany. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
All right. So I'm actually just going to cue this up very quickly. You know, one of the things that we're really focused on in this workshop is really thinking about how do we help the ADRCs think about collecting the data. And as Brad has indicated that, you know, and actually both Brad and Sudeshna have emphasized, is that once you collect the data downstream, there's going to be lots of opportunities, either currently or in the future, that are going to emerge. So, so we're going to sort of kick this part off by just trying to hopefully illustrate how straightforward the data collection of the digital voice itself can be, and then Cody's going to follow with some of the steps that will start to happen once you've collected that data, and then give you a little preview on some other work we're doing on the post-processing side. So maybe Cody, if you could sort of queue up this video, which is, I just want to say something about this this particular video. It's really representative of the types of materials we're going to try to provide to the ADRCs to help them in the step-by-step process, so that you don't need to have highly trained examiners. You know, all of our examiners who do this are research assistants that we've been able to train, and they train up very quickly. And then we have additional written documentation. For instance, Hannah Kraft from Indiana ADRC has spent a lot of time developing what I would say the written version of what we're about to show you. So Cody, can you go ahead and play that, and then you can take it from here.
Yes.
At this point, the recorder should have been set up in advance already according to the instructions in the manual, and the SD card should also be in the recorder. So now, in order to turn the recorder on, you're going to pick up the device, and the on button is on the side, and you're going to pull this button right here and hold it down. Recorder will begin to power on. And now, to prepare a recording, you're going to hit this red button right here. This indicates that we're going to start a recording. And to begin recording, you want to start the session, you would click the play and pause button. So at this point, if I click the play and pause, I would note the participant ID, the date of testing, today's date, and my examiner ID, but that may vary per institution. So once I'm done recording that, I'm going to hit the pause button, and this recorder is now ready in time for when the participant comes, and this will be on standby for now.
So remember to put the recorder as close as possible to the participant on a different table if possible. We don't have a different table here, but facing participant, inform them at this point that we will be recording the response using this digital voice recorder. Once you're ready, just press play and carry on with your usual procedures like neuropsychological testing. And once you are done with that, just press stop, and that should end the recording.
Once you're done recording your session with the participant, and to fully end the recording, you want to hit the square button. So we're going to hit that. And to go access the file and rename it, you're going to click on File. And this is our most recent recording, and we can select that recording by hitting this button right here to select that recording, and it allows us to use that scrolling feature to scroll down to the rename, and we're going to hit that button again in order to rename it. So you can rename your file according to your institution's requirements, and once you rename that, you can click OK using that scrolling button again, and it will be set for you to begin uploading onto a computer. First, you want to create a folder so you can put all of your recording files in it. Next, you want to take the recording cable that came with your device, connect one end to your computer and the other end to the recorder over here. Next, you want to press on the menu button on the side of the recorder. Now you want to make sure storage is selected. If it's not, you can use this scrolling wheel to move the options and use that scrolling wheel to click on it. It's now trying to connect to your computer, and we're able to transfer the files.
So we're going to open up the folder we want our recordings to be uploaded, and we want to open another file window and find our digital recorder. And our digital recorder is right here. So we're going to click on that, and we're going to go to stereo. Our recordings are located in these folders because that's where we uploaded it based on the recording device. These are all of our recordings, and you can also rename them here as well. So you're welcome to rename this to your institution's conventions. Maybe it's the date of the visit and the participant ID, for example. But in order to upload these recordings to your folder, you want to select them all and then right click and click on cut, and then go to your folder that you've made and right click and click paste. So I can do that with one example. I'm gonna right click, cut, and paste it into this folder. So that will remove the recording from the actual device itself. And now it is uploaded in your folder. It's really important that the recordings are no longer on the device itself, since if you're recording the entire neuropsychological part of the UDS, the recordings can get pretty long and you don't want to run out of storage. So it's good that we're cutting and pasting it into the folder. Once you're done uploading your recordings, it's time to eject the device. And this is the standard procedure when you remove any device from a desktop and disconnect it. So you're going to right click the device and click on eject. And now you're all set to disconnect your hardware.
In order to turn this off, You're gonna pull this switch down and hold it there until the device powers off. And now it's off.
Okay, so yes, I'll start with these slides in regards to digital voice processing analysis and results. And so this is just a quick overview of the items we're going to talk about. Largely speaking, I'll be discussing sort of at a high level, just sharing what we're doing at BU and the Framingham Heart Study for each of these. And hopefully that'll be helpful to people here today, and we can use that those ideas and frameworks for ADRCs and otherwise in a helpful manner. So the first sort of diagram here is in regards to intake and quality control. So you will capture your audio, whether that's a physical recorder or another method. And like we saw in the recording, those file names won't really have any meaning generally, just different numbers and characters. And so you will rename it just like in the video, likely with things like the participant ID, the date, the test name if that's applicable, and then the ID of the tester, things like that. And then from there, of course, that's a manual process and one could make errors in that, particularly with the IDs and switching numbers, etc. So a separate schedule record is being maintained that in regards to your visits. So that schedule record could be from anywhere, it could be REDCap or any other sort of database system one might have in place. And I think the work group will provide materials for that in the future. But essentially, those records would include IDs and dates for participants who came in that we expect voice data for. So then those records would be compared to file names, which can be accomplished by automated scripts. And file names that are either not in the record or entries in the records that we don't have files for will be flagged, and then you could sort of resolve those as you go. If you can't resolve them, you set them aside. As they get resolved, you then pass them on to the sort of the next stage as after they've been confirmed. And sort of in the orange area underneath, we have some examples of extra layers of confirmation that can be implemented. So in the video, they referred to saying at the start of the exam an identifier, which includes the tester saying the participant ID, the date, and their own tech ID. And then so that can help to sort of identify if we're sort of ambiguous about what what the file name should be. And if you really need to, you can go through the recording and really compare it specific parts to the BADA results. And then you can really sort of figure out who and what date that recording came from. And then this is sort of a zoomed in example. So, on the left, we have an example of, let's say, data from a REDCap of participants that we expect voice data for. And we see here an example of one case that passed. It matches an entry in the record. And we have one other case of a file name where it doesn't match, where the ID, date, and the tech ID are a little bit off in terms of the order of the numbers. And so the next sort of step that we do is, we do pre-processing and standardization. So all the audio that passes from the previous step, we'll use tools like in the bottom. So that little symbol there, FFmpeg, that's an open source tool. There's that's commonly used for this task. And there's several that are out there. One would save the original metadata, and there's a list of sort of the metadata examples in regards to the file. And files that fail the standardization will get set aside, and you try to resolve them or not. Again, if you can't, for now you set them aside, you flag them accordingly, and the ones that do standardize, you can then sort of pass on to the next step. And to your post-processing, which could include things like feature generation and analysis. And so in terms of feature generation, there are different sort of features you can generate. These are just some examples and some examples of libraries as well. So one could generate acoustic features using libraries like OpenSmile. I know Jet had some questions about speaker segmentation. So Pianote is one of the libraries, open source libraries that can accomplish such tasks. And then one might need to do speaker identification. Even if you divide into speaker 1, speaker 2, you might need to know who the tester or versus the participant is, which speaker they are. There are algorithms that would have to be generated for that. And there are tools like Whisper that can do automated transcriptions, and a couple other tools that can generate natural language processing features based on the transcription contents. And then you can take all those sort of different features and do your, whichever analyses that one might want to do. And so sort of next is sort of post-processing. So this is just a quick indication that there's sort of more to come, particularly in the realm of de-identification, which I know was asked about. So those de-identification tools, which were mentioned in the consent presentation, they're still very much so being developed. But the data in the meantime should be treated like any other, any other data that we're collecting. So the data will not be shared by NACC or otherwise until it's been adequately de-identified. So the de-identification tools are still being worked on. I'm happy to speak more about it and the methods, et cetera, and the details in the Q&A or otherwise, but they might include things like voice masking and PI splicing, et cetera. And so the next few slides are just lists of publications. So these slide deck and others will be shared, so you can dig through these publications as you'd like. But this is just several slides that have publications in regards to digital voice. So I'll just skip through these. And lastly, so we have there is a web page, a digital voice web page. So this is the slide and the web page came from the great work from the folks at NACC. So please take a look. There's a link there. There's a QR code and has a lot of useful resources and things of that nature. So that's pretty much what I have. Happy to answer questions or speak more in detail to different aspects of what we're discussing.
I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the chat, but please feel free to raise your hand or pop a question in the chat if you have one.
Yeah, I think, I just want to make the point that when it comes to de-identification of the digital voice recordings, there's actually multiple levels in which you can de-identify. And so that's what we're really exploring. So one is, taking the original recordings and extracting features, because once you have extracted features like imaging, for instance, then then it is at a level of de-identification. The part that we're having the most, effort devoted to is figuring out how to actually de-identify the voice prints themselves. That's been proving a little bit more challenging. We think that we hopefully by end of this year into early next year, we'll have at least a first version of some voice masking technologies. And again, this is all open source, open access. So this is something that will be freely available to everybody and obviously be then non-proprietary. I would caution everybody in thinking that it'll be the end all and be all, because it won't be. It'll be kind of like Free Surfer version 1.0 at that point, but I think it'll at least start moving this forward and letting us start to at least extract some value of these voice recordings earlier.
Awesome. Thank you, Rhoda. I guess we'll move on to the next part, a presentation by Jeff Kay.
Brittany, I think there was there's one in the chat, WAVE versus MP3. Where,
Oh, yes. Yeah, let me read that out. So from Ronald Hawley, there's a question asking, is there a standard file type, WAVE versus MP3, and bit rate or bit depth minimums?
Yes, absolutely. So it can depend on exactly what you're trying to do. There definitely are recommendations out there. So for instance, Google has a speech to text tool, and so they have a bunch of web pages, and I can share those links. They have web pages that have recommendations for speech to text specifically, which can expand to other uses as well. I think the work group will come together and will come up with specific recommendations for what, depending a little bit on what you want to do, but generally speaking, uncompressed formats like WAVE or FLAC, uncompressed formats at as high of a sampling rate and as high of a bit rate as you can, bit depth and such as you can, usually 16 or 24, et cetera. Again, we'll come up with the specifics of this later, but generally the higher quality uncompressed is recommended. Then because you can then more easily downsample from that to a lower standard format that one might use. Certainly, the higher quality you go, the more storage space it will require. So a minimum requirement or a recommended requirement that can kind of minimize that to save on space would be important. But of course, you want to retain the quality of the data as well. But generally speaking, those are the principles. the specific options and details will come from the group, and I'm happy to share materials in the meantime as well, like the Google recommendations, etc.
Yeah, Cody, can you remind just at least from our Framingham files about how much each file, the size of each file is? I forget.
Yeah, we record at probably too high of a quality, but we record at a very high sampling rate, like 48,000. We have 2 channels stereo, which doubles it. And I forget the other details, the bit depth and stuff, but yeah, it's for every hour, it's about 1 gigabyte, which is very large. Even that quality could be reduced, if you reduce it to single channel, unless you're really using the 2 mics on the recorder for separate purposes, you could cut it in half. There's other ways to sort of cut it down in half, etc. But at the highest could be a bit overkill. It's an hour. An hour would be 1 gigabyte roughly.
Awesome. Well, if there's no other questions, we'll pass it off to Jeff K.
Great, thank you, and everybody who's still with us. So I'm in my brief presentation, I'm just going to talk about some of the directions that the work group is taking regarding the realization that flexibility is going to be key to moving forward. And actually the last question, I think, reflects that. It's my understanding, for example, that if you're recording, like this recording, Zoom records in MP4 files, you can't actually record WAV files off of Zoom, or I think most of the other major platforms. So, if you're doing a remote study recording audio using these platforms, then you have certain compromises you may have to make. Let me just start here by just going over some general considerations. So first of all, we realize that and I'll present this further in a minute, but there's a lot of projects going on and already presented around the country, around the world, using a variety of devices and recording conditions and use cases, which ultimately really should drive why you're collecting the data and how you're collecting the data. But ultimately, if we want to share the data going forward, and I think that is our common goal, we need to have some level of agreement around how we're going to document the data and standardize it. And so that's still a work in progress, but is really a key element to being able to use this data in a shared way. So, of course, we have to, we are encouraging standardization, I think. And this covers a wide number of elements, as we already talked about. So it's important around understanding how the recordings are made. We've been talking, at least this initial ask in a way for NACC is around recording cognitive assessments. Obviously, we've already alluded to a number of other more spontaneous conversation kind of settings and other kinds of recordings, but at least the cognitive assessment is a very specific structured kind of setting, but even there, one needs to have standards about how that's being accomplished and the conditions around those recordings. And for that, there needs to be some kind of, dare I say, red cap form or an NACC form. And I think, again, that was alluded to earlier. I'm going to continue on in a moment to just kind of highlight where there might be some commonalities, but also opportunities to not reinvent the wheel. And so this will also get us into thinking about the future. We want to make it so that ultimately not just necessarily recordings of the cognitive assessments is what's part of the database, but other types of recordings as well that probably will become more common in the future. So there was a survey back in the fall of 2023, which hopefully some people from the various centers may recall. 18 ADRCs indicated on this survey that they were collecting audio files probably during cognitive assessments. The way the survey was structured, it was not entirely clear as to exactly what was happening, but in reading the comments fields, it sounds like most of these were at least during cognitive assessments, as well as there were other scenarios. 8 actually were not collecting, but plan to do this in the future. And 8 said they don't plan to collect this data. And we'll see how that all evolves over time. I think one of the things that we're all keen on is further building out from this survey. I know one of the work groups is actually developing a follow-up to really further understand more specifically what each of at least the current 18 or more centers that are collecting audio files during cognitive assessments, how are they doing it? What are the more specifics around that? And ultimately, by doing that, we should be able to get a better sense of the commonalities and be able to, develop at least a minimum data set for what we should be recording when the files are captured. There are other ADRC affiliated studies going on, or actually they are ADRC studies. It was mentioned briefly, ADNI has, in ADNI 4, is collecting remotely a memory task, the storyteller task that was developed by Novoic, a company. I believe they may have up to 900 of these already captured in their new cycle of ADNI 4. I think it will be very instructive to look at how the protocol and how that is being rolled out now, and see if we can have some alignment there. There's the VCOG study, which a dozen of the ADRCs are banded together, led by Bonnie Sachs at Wake Forest. And there, actually, the recordings are made for quality assurance. They're actually not specifically for data analysis, but I think the pattern is clear where that's going to go. I suspect that we will find that the remotely acquired, video acquired NACC or UDS, well, it will be 4 cognitive battery, will be obtainable by remote assessment as well as in clinic, but the remote assessment will really expand what we can do. And recording that would, I think, also be important to be in parallel with what is done in clinics. And then the lead study, we heard a lot of great update from Brad, so I won't belabor that, but again, there's a clear protocol, and we should be, again, trying to align these and other activities that are going on that are very relevant. There are other potential recordings. I know they were going on at many centers. At our center, we too have been collecting voice recordings during cognitive assessments. Going back to 2007, we were using tape recorders that used magnetic tape. Some of you may be old enough to remember that there were such devices. And Brian Rourke, who now works at Google, was one of the first to look at a combination of lexical as well as speech features and showed that you could differentiate individuals with MCI and those age-matched controls by looking at these audio recordings. And I would mention these were what might be considered not very high quality. Most of these were actually acquired during home visits. So this is something I think that we can look at and realize that it's doable, but we need to be cognizant of the challenges. iConnect was mentioned prominently today and appropriately. This program of research really that Hiroko Dodge has been leading now for actually many years is a great example of looking at conversational, more spontaneous speech, although even there, it's a semi-structured kind of conversation, but nevertheless, definitely a different kind of data to capture, but also with lots of potential. The same kind of setup has been used by my colleague Alison Lindauer at our center in a clinical trial or intervention for behavioral management for caregivers, or not the behavior caregivers, but to help them manage at home the person that they're caring for with dementia in the Telestella project. And here, the interactions of the training program of Telestella for the caregivers is recorded, and those files are also available for analysis. Excuse me, as another area that I don't think we've actually been thinking about as much. So the caregivers and others in the research world. And then finally, a terrific project that my colleague Raina Croft at our center has been conducting for many years called the SHARP study, which is conducted in an African-American population. It's a exercise, socialization, and reminiscence therapy brain health promotion program. As part of this program, triads walk in the community with a recorder or a smartphone, and they reach certain areas that are come up on the phone and tell them remind them that it's an area of interest from their past. They then have a conversation which is recorded. And those audio files are then available for various kinds of analysis. And one of the other parts of that analysis, which is separate, but again, just to kind of help people think further about this in the future, the transcripts of those recordings have been put together into an oral history for the community to give back to the project. So it's kind of another avenue that one might explore using digital recordings. All right, so back to the current world, I guess, or where we are. There is a lot to consider towards standardization. We have this terrific 45-page manual, which there will be a test later this week on for everybody. But it's very detailed and has all the considerations that go into doing this kind of work in a research setting. And it's, again, one of those things that I think will be used as a roadmap or guidepost for how we document and put this data together ultimately for sharing. I think what we hope to do also, though, is to look at all the other centers and projects that I mentioned, whether they have a manual or protocol. Well, they all have protocols, I'm sure, but what the details are for those, and try to harmonize those together to come up with what is the most usable, flexible, and honestly, least effort. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we also know that this currently is a volunteer effort for centers, so we want to minimize the amount of work frankly, that goes into this. And it's not minimal. I mean, obviously, whenever you do something additional, it takes extra help and attention. And so just to end, there are many considerations. Here, just a couple, which we'll immediately face is, what's the general metadata that needs to be collected? We might think of it almost as a minimum data set for these audio recordings. And I think that this is very doable to come to some agreements about, but it has to be kind of finalized, I think. And then the second area that's already come up is this area of editing and annotation of files, which, with all due respect to everybody who's spoken today, is still not trivial, and will take a lot of thought and some work. But it can be done, and it is being done, and we do still have to consider it. And I think that's my last, I know that's my last slide, and I can go back to our meeting.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. I'll kick off the Q&A with a question from the chat. This is from Michelle McDonald asking, will there be measures taken to protect the neuropsychological recordings? Neuropsychologists are advised to prevent the release of stimulus materials, test procedures, etc. of neuropsychological data. Having these things recorded allows for the potential release of this information. In addition to the NACC battery, some sites may include copyright protected measures in their site-specific battery. What steps can be taken to protect the collection of that specific copyright material? And can we opt out of recording those measures?
So somebody is going to give a better answer, but it does bring up something that I think is up for consideration, and that is, we're talking about, we want the most uncompressed raw audio files, so to speak. It is possible that one considers processed data, just like, you might consider the difference between, you get a amyloid PET read. It's a clinical read. It's amyloid positive or negative. And that's that's processed data. It's human processed data. Well, I guess it's all human processed at some level currently. But it's possible that one could consider there are agreed upon metrics that are put in the database, and that becomes what's recorded. And the audio files may not necessarily need to be harbored at NACC. But again, I think there's a number of issues that obviously this question raises. They're separate.
If there are any other questions, please feel free to raise your hand or pop them in the chat. Okay, awesome. Well, we'll move on to the next section. I'll hand things off to Melissa Lamar.
Hi, everyone. I am just gonna share my screen really quickly. I get the very lovely task of kind of telling you that actually we have a frequently asked questions document that is on the website, and you can see some of the questions here with some of the answers. And so actually today was wonderful because I've been kind of jotting down some of the questions that were asked and answered here as well. So we'll add those to it. But just so you know that we have this resource that is available and will be growing as kind of such a organic FAQ type document might, for everyone to use and kind of understand as much as possible. I know there's been a lot of great questions already. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time going over these because I think many of them have already been answered in the wonderful presentations that we saw today. However, hopefully you've learned a bit more about the benefits of doing digital biomarkers and what that what might come back from that for science and potentially for participants as well as your own center. And really, want to just make sure that we've got enough time left to go over any additional questions or concerns or thoughts. Every center is going to be unique and may have their own issues or concerns, but I think the more that we can discuss them, we'll learn and be able to adapt, and the working group can kind of take that back into consideration. So really, I'd like to very quickly kind of pivot back to all of our speakers and all of you attendees for any additional questions that you might have.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the chat. Looks like we presented so well that there's no unanswered questions. Yeah, please feel free to pop any questions in the chat. You can also email us at nacmail@uw.edu, and we can forward those along to the CTF Tech Workgroup to answer. I'll pop that email in the chat as well. Thank you, Hannah. Wonderful. Well, if there are no questions, I think we can hand things off to some closing remarks provided by Nina Silverberg.
So I really want to thank all of the really terrific speakers. I think the presentations were varied and covered apparently a lot of everybody's questions. I want to just reinforce what was said earlier about how important this type of data is already, and our expectations of the value of digital voice and other digital data in the future. This is something I have personally been working on for, I will say, decades. At the beginning, a couple of you mentioned that you were at the VA in Boston, and I was as well way back when. My degree is actually in psycholinguistics. So this is something near and dear to my heart and my background and my interests and how I actually got into Alzheimer's disease research. So I'm very excited about the opportunities that this can present. And I think the questions that we got were fantastic, very relevant and important. It's great that we have so many people that are interested in making sure we do this and making sure we do it in the right way and the best way. We did decide to start with digital voice because we thought it would be, of all of the potential opportunities, the easiest to implement and fit in with what we're already doing. So I hope others agree. There are definitely some important concerns, and we're happy to hear them and take them into consideration and make sure that we address them. I think the team is really thinking this through very carefully, but as you could see from Dr. Dickerson's presentation, this is already being done and has been done for a long time with really good agreement from participants. They're interested to learn what can be done with their voice and the recordings as well. So I think there's a lot of excitement in the field. This will bring a significant amount of added value to what we already have, which is substantial across the ADRCs. I think it's long overdue, in fact, that we at least get going on this digital data recording. And so I'm happy that NACC facilitated this and is facilitating our ability to incorporate it with the rest of the data that's being collected at the ADRCs. I noted that we have a couple other NIA colleagues listening in on this. And so there's definitely interest at NIA because of the fact that it's important to the field. And so I envision that there will be even more, there already are funding opportunities that are relevant for utilizing this type of data. And so again, I just want to really thank all of the speakers and the teams who helped put everything together for today, and look forward to having this data be available for the ADRC community and the researchers more broadly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nina. All right. Well, I think that marks the end of this workshop. So again, please reach out to us at NACmail at uw.edu if you have any questions, and we will be posting this recording on the NAC website following the workshop, as well as the slides.
Yeah, I think there was one question for Brad, but I think he had to head off. So maybe it's something we'll have to push to Brad offline.
Yeah, I got that. Got that copy. Thank you, Rhoda.
Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.